Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Natasha Nsabimana. I am an assistant professor of anthropology here at the University of Chicago. Before I begin introductions, I want to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, Director Riley Norton, Tracy Matthews, Jacqueline Gaines, and Marilyn Willis, as well as the Academic Unit Organizing Committee for bringing us together this afternoon. For those who are just becoming acquainted with us, we formed a committee in the summer of 2020 to explore the possibility of founding a new department devoted to the critical study of race at the University of Chicago in the wake of faculty, student, and staff mobilization under the More Than Diversity campaign and the global flurry of insurgency and protest against state violence and white vigilantism. Today, I am proud to moderate the second conversation in our speaker series with Conversations on Indigenous Studies with TallBear and Clint Carroll. I will introduce both shortly, but first I want to call your attention to the subsequent event on our calendar for the winter quarter. A conversation on Black studies at historically Black colleges and universities with Beverly Guy Schefter and Joshua Meyer on March 5th. On Center and Departmental Relations with Tricia Rose and Farah Griffin on March 12, and on Critical University Studies with Rod Ferguson on April 23rd, and all begin at 3 p.m. Central. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce two experts in the field of Indigenous studies. Our first guest, TallBear, is an associate professor in Native Studies at the University of Alberta in Canada and a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Environment. Raised on the Flandreau Santee Sioux Reservation in South Dakota and in St. Paul, Minnesota by her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, TallBear is an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota and a descendant of the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe of Oklahoma. She is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. Professor TallBear is also a member of the Oak Lake Writers, a group of Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota writers. Their works include This Stretch of the River, a collection of memoirs, historical and critical essays, and poems. Another collection, Black Hills Dream, released in August 2011 by Living Justice Press, documents Oseti-Sakoan people's ongoing relationships with the Black Hills. Our other guest, Clint Carroll, is Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado. A citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Professor Carroll works closely with Cherokee people in Oklahoma on issues of land conservation and the perpetuation of land-based knowledge and ways of life. His book, Roots of Our Renewal, Ethnobotany and Cherokee Environmental Governance, explores how tribal nature resource managers navigate the material and structural conditions of settler colonialism, as well as how recent efforts in cultural revitalization are informing such practices through traditional forms of decision-making and local environmental knowledge. Professor Carroll also serves as principal investigator on a study about Cherokee plant gathering access in rural northeastern Oklahoma. Through this integrated education and community-based research projects, elders, students, and Professor Carroll seek to formulate lasting methods for maintaining Cherokee land-based knowledge and better understand how Cherokee people negotiate access to land due to complex ownership patterns and the impact of shifting climate conditions. Welcome, Professor TallBear and Professor Carroll. All right, so the first question is a general question about the field of Indigenous studies, but I wanted to get a sense of how you came to Indigenous studies. So if you could describe your formative encounter with Indigenous studies, how you were first introduced to the field, and how have the various institutions you have called home contributed to your evolving relationship to the field? We can start with Professor TallBear.
Okay, I'm going to try to only take a couple of minutes because I could talk all day about this. I encountered Native studies when I was about 4 years old. So I knew who Vine Deloria was from the time before I could read. That would have been around 1973. the American Indian movement is very active at that time. And my mom was a university student. And so Vine Deloria Jr.'s first book was in our house and was very influential at that time. Also was around the University of Minnesota American Indian Studies program as a kid because we lived in the Twin Cities and my mom was friends with people there. And that'll get later on to the history of American Indian Studies. It really, I mean, I think as other forms of ethnic studies, Black studies, et cetera, it comes out of, I think, student movements and activism, right, in this era of the late 1960s and early 1970s. But got degrees in other fields as most, I think, Native and Indigenous studies scholars today, because we haven't had a lot of graduate programs for very long, right? So most of us are trained in other fields. So the first time I was actually in Native studies after all three of my degrees was in my first job at Arizona State University. And I left fairly quickly. Long, complicated story, but I left Native studies and was exploring more science studies fields and environmental studies. And I think Clint and I have that in common. I was actually an assistant professor in the place where he got his PhD, the College of Natural Resources at Berkeley, but eventually was recruited to Canada. And I really wanted to be in Native studies for reasons that'll become clear later on in this conversation. I wanted to be in an Indigenous centric place where we are the majority and not the token. Where I perceive that we had more real institutional power, and there are very few places that Indigenous studies has that. And it was becoming increasingly difficult the older and more senior I got to be a tokenized minority in the only Native scholar or one of two Native scholars in a department. And I was frankly getting pretty bitter about it. I think my work I was doing great in the US, but it has totally flourished in Canada because I am at a place where there are so many Indigenous faculty, staff, and students. And so, and we are the only Indigenous studies faculty in North America. So the equivalent of a college in the United States, we have our own dean. To me, this has been key. So that's my quick but circuitous path through Native studies.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be a part of this dialogue with this movement, and to be here, especially with Kim, is pretty amazing. And I really applaud the format because I was aware that we're kind of serving to represent our field, and that's a very daunting thing for me to think about. In my mind, being very humble about kind of coming into Native studies, and so I'm really glad to have Kim here to provide a dynamic interaction here as far as the dialogue goes. I wasn't brought up in a community organizing environment, so I come to Native studies as in a very different way. For me, it was almost a stumbling upon the field because well, I have a very windy road when it comes to higher education, and my path through it. I started out, attempting at a four-year college, dropped out, worked outside of the academy, went back to school in the community college system, and then through that was directed to Arizona. So I applied thinking I was applying to ASU, but it turns out that my application went to the University of Arizona, and I, at the time, didn't know the difference between the two. So this being really one of the more formative moments in my life as a young scholar, because it turns out that the U of A was the home at one point for Vine Deloria Jr. that Kim was talking about as being a formative figure in the development of the field. And it was a program, American Indian Studies program, and at the time had a PhD and an undergraduate minor, and still does. I think they might have developed beyond that, but I ended up getting a minor in American Indian Studies and majored in applied anthropology. But it's worth stating that my home was Indian Studies. That's where I worked as an intern. That's where I found intellectual community and mentorship from Native faculty. And it's been a profound influence upon me as a scholar going forward to Berkeley. Again, as Kim stated, received my PhD in environmental science, policy, and management. But did so from that framework of Native studies, and encountered a lot of roadblocks and obstacles along the way in terms of trying to figure out what that means. But it's always been my intellectual center and my intellectual home. I ended up, my first job in academia was at the University of Minnesota in the department, the oldest department of American Indian Studies in the United States. And so that was another opportunity for me to kind of get a sense of, what does it mean not only to do this work, but to teach in a department. And I'm sure we'll get into more of this conversation later in the dialogue here. But what does it mean to teach in a Department of American Indian Studies there? It's just it's obviously a historic department, but it's just in terms of what it offers, its strengths are in not only the curriculum for Native studies broadly, but in Dakota and Ojibwe languages. And so there really kind of hit home how robust that was and how much it was buttressed by those language programs that centered really that as one of the core pillars of how we form our knowledges and theories. And I've since gone on, I'm, as you said, as you noted, a associate professor in ethnic studies at CU Boulder, which has also expanded my kind of sense and awareness of situating myself within the academy, specifically as an Indigenous studies scholar within an ethnic studies department, which we can certainly hit on later as well. But I'll just stop there. That's my take on it. And I'm sure we have a lot more questions to go where we'll hit on many other parts of that story.
Yeah, perhaps this is it's an excellent segue actually to just invite you to talk more generally about the field of Indigenous studies and how it came to be, the circumstances, historical, political behind its genesis. Kim already touched on that a little bit, so maybe if you could start, Kim, and Clint can take it from there.
Yeah, I didn't go back and review all of the reading I've done on the early days of organizing Native studies, but just because I was around at that time, it does come out of student organizing. I think part of the problem early on was, of course, we didn't have a lot of Native people in the faculty, right? And the people that were studying Natives were doing so from this very patronizing, usually anthropological worldview. And that this is why a lot of early Native studies is pushing back on the anthropological gaze. And this is what a lot of Vine Deloria's book, Custer Died for Your Sins, is about. Part of the early problem is, and we're still overcoming this, I think, although since the advent of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, or NASA, in 2007, suddenly things have really bloomed and we've made a lot of, I hate the word progress, but I'll use it for shorthand. Early on, though, there were people being hired who were not being hired into tenure track positions. They might not have had PhDs. People were being hired out of student services. So you can't have a new discipline emerge as being academically legitimate, staffed by junior people, non-tenure track people, non-academics. And this is what's happening in the early days. So this means that it took Native studies a long time to get any legitimacy within the academy as a real discipline. And this is still a fight that we're fighting, trying to establish ourselves as our own discipline. So that's a little bit about the early organizing. So Native American and Indigenous Studies, or NASA, comes into being. The pre-meetings were in 2007 and 2008. It gets incorporated in 2009. I've been to every single meeting. I was on the council, I think 2010 to 13, I was on NASA council. Really, it's made an incredible difference. We now, I think, had 2,000 people at our meeting in Waikato in New Zealand in 2019. Mexico meeting was, of course, canceled due to COVID. We move around between, we've moved between Canada, US, and New Zealand. I don't think we've been in Australia yet, and we were supposed to go to Mexico last year. So that's really helped grow the field of critical Indigenous studies. And within that, we do talk about, it's not only American Indian studies or Native studies that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. Maori studies emerges in New Zealand, Native studies emerges in Canada. I'm a little bit less familiar with what happened in Australia, but these are kinds of the four major countries that are in conversation now at NASA. We do have some participation as well from across the Pacific. We've had people from Taiwan. We run into a little bit of trouble, and also participation from Latin America, which the facilitation of that is difficult because of the language, because of the visa problems. I've been an advocate of not holding very many meetings in the United States because how violent, the borders to come into the it's just violent. And we don't need our global Indigenous scholars being harassed at the US border. So, but part of the problem in being truly global is not only the language barrier, the visa barrier and all that, and we're dominated by English speaking Indigenous studies, it's the concept of indigeneity does not work evenly around the world. And so, across many parts of Africa or Asia, for example, it's uneven in terms of people's acceptance of the term, right? And so that's something we have to grapple with in making a truly global Indigenous studies. But it's also exciting to think about that as well, and having conversations around that terminology of Indigenous. I don't want that to, we do need to, I think, center that term, but I also don't want it to inhibit us having those kinds of conversations, particularly with parts of the world where it's not working as well. I don't know if that's kind of an answer to the conversation. So right now things are looking pretty good compared to where we were before. I think before NAISA happened. I don't know, maybe Clint has a slightly different perspective or something to add.
Sure. I would agree, again, kind of referencing back to situating myself within an environmental science department at Berkeley, really predating the formation of NAISA, and comparing that to post-NAISA formation has been just an incredible sea change in the types of works that we see out there, the types of theoretical discussions, the type of networking and just kind of relationship building as scholars has been enabled in much different ways than it was before. And I would just say that, it's just as kind of adding to the story here and my thinking about the origins of the field, certainly that moment of, the late 60s and the formation when we see, in 69, for example, the Department of American Indian Studies at Minnesota come into being. It also, was based upon or building upon the type of intellectual production that Native people have been doing and contributing to, maybe not necessarily the academy directly, but in ways that have generated the conversations that led up to that moment, not only in terms of the American Indian movement and the types of intellectualism that went into that, but also even predating that and working within various areas or arenas within the US settler state, and then also literary production as well. So these types of contributions that kind of contributed to what we could call the canon, if you will, of Native literary production, but also Native participation in settler state governance in ways that benefit and promoted Native rights, are certainly a part of that formation as a field and continue to get talked about in our circles. But I would also just say, going back to NAISA and what it represents and really kind of having poured over some of Kim's writing before this dialogue, and looking at how we are being pushed in ways by our colleagues and by this collectivity to explore Native studies beyond these kind of foundational disciplinary homes. So literary studies, anthropology being kind of two of the main ones. And nonetheless being central to some continued work in the field, but looking at science and technology studies as kind of being a break out of that that box in ways that, again, centers Indigenous thought and theory, but does so in ways that applies to a much broader set of disciplinary arenas. And so I think we'll get to that in the next question, but I just kind of speaking again, informally and off the cuff about my reflections of, the origins of the field and kind of looking at it today and my experiences, specifically in regard to how, NAISA has become a hub for that activity. And it's just a really exciting time. And it really kind of makes it to where Indigenous studies as a discipline is no longer something that can be easily ignored or eschewed by some of the mainstream or dominant disciplines that, I think we will get to this later in the dialogue, but that may feel or may be kind of questioning whether Indigenous studies is you know, for lack of a better analogy, running up against some of its turf, if that makes any sense. So kind of referencing kind of limited resources within an institution and the kind of politics therein.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving us that historical political background. So now today, how would you define the field of Native studies or Indigenous studies? How do you understand its pedagogic mission, thematic preoccupation, formative approach? Kim, you've already touched on the tensions and the difficulty of applying, the multiple understanding of indigeneity globally. So the field itself, what is, how do you understand the formative approach, the pedagogic mission of what has now come to be Native studies?
So I'm going to quote.
Okay.
This book just came out. It's backwards probably, but the Rutledge Handbook of Critical Indigenous Studies. So our former dean, Brendan Hokofitu, is the lead editor on this. Our current dean is on here, Linda Smith, Aileen Morton Robinson, and Steve Larkin in Australia. So this is those countries I talked about. And so because some of those scholars are formative in my faculty and also in the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, there's a couple of founding members on there. I just want to read a quick quote about the field from that book. And this is in Brendan Hokofitu's introduction. And this is Critical Indigenous Studies. First emanates out of a genealogy of Indigenous, Black, and Brown scholarship that has sought to criticize the unsettler / white claims to possession over knowledge itself. Second, Critical Indigenous Studies refers to scholarship grounded in resistance to the multiple forms of violence and microaggressions that Indigenous peoples and communities face every day and their neo-colonial realities. Third, Critical Indigenous Studies refers to scholarship that upholds, and this is key, sovereign claims to Indigenous lands, languages, cultures, ecologies, ontologies, and existentiality. Now, we can have arguments about sovereignty. We're working in English. This is not my term of choice. But any discipline that wants to oppose Indigenous sovereignty and claims to land is anti-Indigenous. I'm hard on that. So that's why because there's those kinds of conversations happening right now. And so I want to make it clear that anybody who proposes that is not understanding the centrality of land and material resources to Indigenous, and I don't like the word identity, but I'll use it, is missing the point. Indigenous peoples are co-constituted with place. This is not about biology. I mean, ultimately we can talk about that because the materiality of our bodies is related to the materiality of the land. But you will be hard pressed to find Indigenous peoples who do not center place in the constitution of who we are as peoples. And Indigenous studies is about defending our right to exist as peoples, capital P. And that's part of what's, getting gotten at in that definition, in addition to the kind of intellectual genealogies. Indigenous studies has always, because we are the, sort of particularly in the United States, we are the smallest demographic group ethnically in the United States, right? We are like 0.5% of the US population. You might go up to as much as 1.5 if you take the census, but I wouldn't. So we have always had to be engaged with the kind of intellectual genealogies of other disciplines and other peoples, right? And also because we have to think about the intersections of race and indigeneity, we have tended to be very outward looking as well into other fields where people are doing race studies, but we think very clearly about the intersections of race and indigeneity, and this is also really key, right? Because those are intersecting categories, but they're not the same thing. So I don't know if I've been kind of all over the place, but I really like that quote. Yeah.
And I will also not necessarily quote, but I will draw from other colleagues of ours who have really thought really deeply and intently about this question. And also just to kind of fill in too, kind of what we mean when we add the qualifier critical, right? There's a difference between, or at least there's a marked departure that our colleagues have insisted on when using this term critical Indigenous studies that really differentiate the study of Indigenous peoples as kind of as subjects, and the endogenous work that we do from within Indigenous societies, communities, nations, to place our thought, our epistemological orientations, and the theory that produces at the center of what we do as scholars, and how that's informed. Again, at this point, I'm drawing from Daniel Justice. Well, going back to my previous comment about what we mean by critical, that's Eileen Moreton Robinson kind of making those assertions as she introduces the book Critical Indigenous Studies, which Kim has published in as well. But Daniel Justice later goes on to talk about, again, how do we define the field of critical Indigenous studies? And he asserts that it's transformational, it's dedicated to community, to truth, multiplicity, and complexity. It's justice-oriented toward each other and toward our more than human relatives. So as Kim was saying, it can't be divorced from locality or place. And in fact, Justice is asserting that place and locality is central to Native American and Indigenous studies centers and departments. And so that's something that perhaps we'll get into more in terms of the nuts and bolts of how we position ourselves on university campuses in relation to place, in relation to community. I think is a really important thing that, we're all at varying degrees of, how far along we are in that process. Of course, given colonial histories and specifically histories of dispossession, removal of Indigenous peoples, it makes it a different process depending on where you find yourself in the academy. But I will leave that for another question. Those are my thoughts, again, drawing from work in the field about, what does it mean to do what we do as scholars?
Yeah, thank you. So I have two follow-up questions. Maybe we can take up one first. I wonder if you can elaborate on the intersections between Indigenous studies and other fields like Black studies or ethnic studies. So maybe let's begin there. And then we can move to the relationship of Indigenous studies to doing informed or engaged scholarship and work with community. So the first, on the intersections between Indigenous studies, critical Indigenous studies, Native studies with other fields like Black studies or ethnic studies, and then we'll tackle the community question afterwards. Kim, do you want to begin?
Sure. And I have to say, I've really stayed away from ethnic studies. So I'm interested to hear what Clint's experience is like. I'm not a fan of putting Indigenous studies into an ethnic studies department. I think the rest of ethnic studies is not about sovereignty, and it's not about necessarily place-based peoplehood. And I think I'm interested to know how that can be made to work. And, maybe Clinton can talk about that in relationship to Colorado. I'm totally unfamiliar with I'm more familiar with Berkeley's model. So yeah, that would not be my first choice, but not having been in that field. So I would say, and I'm just going to sort of speak personally a little bit about my experiences in terms of the other fields that I and my colleagues whose work I know really well, what they articulate with. As I was saying earlier, I mean, and I do race, right? So you can't, it's very difficult to take up indigeneity within these settler states without also being familiar with race literature. And that looks different from country to country, right? So that's really interesting because racial formations are different from nation state to nation state. And so in the United States, of course, we're engaging, and I see this in Australia as well, we're engaging heavily with Black scholars' work on race, right? Because we have to it's important to understand how Native people, I use the term red, most people don't, but historically how red people were racialized differently in relationship to whiteness than the way that Black people were racialized. You have to understand these things in order to understand the sort of way historically that settler colonial states have managed Black populations, have managed Native populations. You've got to understand their racial formations, their notions of race, and the way they categorize and manage. So I would say that Native studies in the United States, Australia, probably New Zealand as well, and Canada is heavily involved in race literature. Now, those racial dynamics might be a little bit different in Canada. There's a lot of overlap. So I think it's safe to say that Indigenous scholars in those countries are, if we're dealing with race at all, and I would say many of us are, that we're dealing with non-Indigenous racial scholarship on race. Of course, many of us as well are you interested in other disciplinary areas or just mostly ethnic studies and other area studies in terms of our?
No, I think critical race studies as well and Black studies, those intersections.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think you've seen a real take up with critical race studies. I mean, especially that critical Indigenous studies. It's another volume that Aileen Morton Robinson edited. I mean, she's very much in conversation with George Lipsitz's work. So that's pretty common, I think. So that's a point of intersection. I'm trying to think also, feminist studies, right? We've got a lot of Indigenous scholars who've looked at feminist studies, women and gender studies, because they're also pushing back on white feminism, and have had a lot of conversation with Black feminism, I think, as well. I really don't want to speak to the ethnic studies. I'm really interested to hear what Clint has to say on that. So maybe I'll just stop there for right now, and then maybe I can come back in if anything he says prompts something else.
Sure. It's been, for me, coming from an American Indian Studies department to an ethnic studies department, actually really generative and enlightening, and I felt like we, as a faculty, as a department, I should say, to not confuse with Canadian scholars, as a department, we are still actively working through what this looks like, even though our department originated in the 80s. And so the impetus for that has been the formation of our PhD program. And that has provided this venue, or this arena in which faculty, so my colleagues and I, and our graduate students are able to kind of hash out, what does this mean to get a PhD in comparative ethnic studies or critical ethnic studies? And I'll just kind of pick up on that note, because I think, once again, acknowledging, as Kim really eloquently stated, that racialization and for lack of a better term, the compartmentalization of knowledge and race, and has been one means by which colonial and imperial powers have sought to kind of define difference, and therefore creating racism and all these other isms that have, if we aren't careful, can kind of define our intellectual subject matter as far as uncritically. But that brings me to the use of the term critical, which is implied in our department's name. It's how we all operate as scholars. And so what does it mean, in terms of critical ethnic studies, and how does that look like? It's, again, being conscious of this racialization, but then also, similar to critical Indigenous studies, having a clear emphasis on how our collective works can serve to center marginalized thought, voices, theory, experiences. And so, in terms of how we understand ourselves as a department, we might kind of say that ethnic studies is a field, and Native and Indigenous studies is a discipline, as well as Chicanx, Latinx studies, Africana and African American studies, and Asian American studies. And so we operate with this kind of sense of we are an interdisciplinary field. We're also very much emphasizing the ways that our disciplines speak to one another. And so that's where it's definitely something that I don't feel like I can speak to definitively today, because I'm constantly learning, and the backlog of books and articles that I have to read is over my head as we speak, in terms of just getting familiar not only with my colleagues' work, but those who are writing at these intersections that I feel is very productive and stimulating, like Tiffany Lethabo King's work. And so I'm just kind of thinking about, how we speak to one another through this kind of framework as a department, looking at ethnic studies as an interdisciplinary field, but looking at it in which those disciplines are our own kind of core homes, like Native and Indigenous studies. And so some of the connections that we are working with as colleagues are, decolonial studies, critical race theory, intersectionality, critical whiteness studies, and then critical university studies, which is something that is not explicit necessarily in our curriculum, but I will tell you comes up at every single faculty meeting we have. So it's just one of those things that being situated within an ethnic studies department you cannot operate separately from being critical of the institution of which you are in. And so I would say that, just to kind of reference Rod Ferguson's work of what does it mean to be in the institution but not of it, and how can we use and leverage our collective contributions through the way that we decenter Western thought and center our own philosophies and thoughts and epistemologies collectively, and also at the same time support one another in that work. And so that's been the greatest, I would say, part about being a member of an ethnic studies faculty or department is that it opens up those other dialogues in ways that I think, again, create an intimacy with them. You're working with folks on a regular basis. You're thinking through these kind of lateral solidarities, not only within the institution, but of course without outside of academia, and trying to grapple with and understand our activism and movements against white supremacy and layers of additional I guess you could say a resurgence against these structures and forces. So I'll stop there because I feel like I'm getting long-winded, but I could say a lot more just in conversation about what that transition, if you will, felt like, and also, some of the constraints certainly coming from an Indian Studies department, but also some of the openings and the possibilities, and really the beautiful possibilities that I see going forward as we continue to build and strategize together.
Kim, did you want to add something, or vis-a-vis ethnic studies, or no? You said
no, that was interesting. Yeah. Yeah, Clint and I have really, I think that's really interesting. It's a great conversation. We talk a lot about the difference between Indigenous studies being its own thing and then being in ethnic studies, right? It's kind of an ongoing conversation at NASA, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about the relationship. You brought up being in the institution, but not of it. So one other question, basically, I want to know how successful you have been in realizing the kind of model of engaged scholarship that informs the field of Native studies. So the relationship of knowledge produced, let's say, in the university, and its accountability to communities outside of the university, the kinds of integrated form of research with people in and out of the university. If you can touch on that kind of collaboration.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're pretty successful at University of Alberta, but this is where I brought numbers in. We have 1,100 Indigenous students at the University of Alberta. We have, within the Faculty of Native Studies, we've got 11 staff, 15 tenured or tenure line professors, and 5 instructors and postdocs. We've also got an Indigenous faculty and Indigenous ed unit over in the Ed School. We've got Indigenous faculty in Extension, in English and Film Studies, in Agricultural Life. So we've got them in faculties across campus, right? Because this is an Indigenous city. That makes a huge difference. I'm saying that because I don't think everybody across the land should jump on the Indigenous studies bandwagon. I think you need to figure out regionally and locally what your strengths are, or it's going to be if you want to do the in community engaged model, which I think is central to the way that we have conceived of Indigenous studies globally, right? Community engagement's incredibly important, which it's obviously that's something you're thinking about. So and this bleeds into some of the other questions. I think we have the institutional capacity to do that. You cannot do good Indigenous community engagement simply by having good intention on the part of faculty and students. You actually need people that have local and regional connections. So I get asked all the time to apply for jobs all over Canada. I've never worked with First Nations in British Columbia. I'm not the person to do that, right? Like I don't even know how to pronounce their names out there, let alone have connections in those communities. So what's really going to be key, I think, is having people who know your locality and your region, and know the particular Indigenous history there. Now, there are no federally recognized tribes in Illinois. It's like a sea of removal around there. However, it's a major relocation city. So I know there's a big Native population there. It's an urban population. It's a multi-tribal population. It's really interesting to think about what are the tribal people like. I'm sure they're coming from Wisconsin and Michigan, many of them. I know people who have, but there's also many people who come from all over across the country. So that it's interesting. It's an interesting city, right? It's also an interesting Black city. Like, so what do you have locally and regionally? I would really build a program around that. And I know, and so this is what's interesting to me about what U of C is thinking about. I mean, this is an elite private institution. It's not the same as trying to do Native studies at Arizona State University or the University of Alberta or Saskatchewan. But nonetheless, you still have this kind of vibrant local community that should probably be a big part of how you conceive of the way that you will approach this. This isn't some kind of pan-national thing. I don't think that works, right? I can't say about Black studies, but for Indigenous studies, I don't think that works as well. So we have been successful, but we really focus on Cree, Blackfoot students. We've got Métis scholars. We really focus on this sort of several group, particularly Cree and Métis, because that's the majority of our population. And we focus on Cree language. Clint brought up language. Language is key. I don't know how you address that in such a multi-tribal place as Chicago and a place like Illinois where there's no tribe. I don't know if there's even well, that's a whole other conversation, but that I'm curious as to how you would address that. I don't think you should be doing Indigenous studies without some element of Indigenous language, because Indigenous ontology comes out of that, right? It really is key to doing a robust pro-Indigenous scholarship. I don't know if I answered the question. I started getting into other questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Clint?
And I think that's really valuable too for Kim to kind of, again, highlight and be consciously aware of who we're talking to right now. Because, I mean, granted, the question is how do we as in, individuals and our colleagues navigate this at our own institutions in the hopes that we can generate a dialogue. But I would agree with Kim that it's going to vary tremendously in terms of the goals and aspirations and commitments that one can make depending on where you're at. And again, to reemphasize the relationships that you've built or that you will continue to build. And just to kind of segue on that, that's a lifelong process for us here at CU, and it's something that is going to be continuous. I should also mention my relations with place are really I guess you could say vis-a-vis my relationship with my spouse, who's Northern Arapaho, something that I should have opened up and situated myself within in terms of being on Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute territories, living here in Longmont, Colorado, which is another issue unto itself, but I won't get into that. The fact that Boulder is cost prohibitive for most professors at CU. But nonetheless, how do we develop those relationships in ways that acknowledge the dispossession that occurred, the fact that it's 6 hours away from my spouse's community, reservation community at Wind River in Wyoming, and then nurture that in ways that make sense, in addition to acknowledging and working with the Denver Indian community, which is significant. It was, as Minneapolis and Chicago were, a hub for urban Indian relocation. And so I don't have the answer right now. I'm working toward building those relationships, and it's really key too to emphasize that this is not something that, again, to reference back to Kim's statement, that anyone can do, nor is it something that you can do without resources from the administration. To be able to be expected at an R1 to cultivate relationships and achieve tenure based on the standards that R1 institutions have. you know, again, if we go into the issues of tenured versus untenured faculty, I feel finally that I'm recently tenured, I should say. I'm at a position in which I can start to really think about looking ahead into toward that future of what would this look like. And collaborating, I should mention, you know, aside from thinking about my position within an ethnic studies department, we're really fortunate to have a community who are, let me rephrase that. We have a center that creates a community and a hub for the work that we do in Native Studies. So we have the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies at CU Boulder. That, again, it's a different formation than a department. And it does have its challenges, but nonetheless, it provides a venue through which we can collaboratively do that work and work toward those relationships in ways that acknowledge, again, the place and the centrality of place and the relationships that come out of that with Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute people who, again, are far removed from where we are in Boulder. I would say with regard to my own research and community-based work, it's, you know, there are contradictions. I don't think I have time to get into all of them, but I'm funded, as you mentioned, through the National Science Foundation. And of course, they don't have an Indigenous Studies Directorate. They have the closest thing to my area is a Cultural Anthropology Directorate or program. And the Geography and Spatial Sciences program. They do have an endangered, documenting endangered languages, which I'm also partially funded through. But nonetheless, seeing anthropology as kind of, once again, one of those disciplines that, for better or worse, I'm wedded to through my work and through the methods that I use. You know, it's been kind of an awkward development with regard to grant support. I believe, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm almost positive that this type of award, which is a career award, is the first one to be awarded to an ethnic studies department or someone within an ethnic studies department. And so I've had a lot of learning curve to try and understand what it means to manage a grant, and also to realize that we are understaffed in terms of the resources that our administration has for our small department. Also, if we talk about the nuts and bolts of what we call ICR, or, you know, the overhead that is allocated to departments, you know, that's another conversation altogether. But, you know, it was only after the fact that I realized that I did have, or would have had, some say, if I had realized it, in allocating some of those funds to go to, for example, the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies. So, you know, I'm thinking about the work that I do and how it's funded through this mechanism. And yet there's a whole nother element of politics and you know, bureaucracy and understanding of grant management that I feel like I was not equipped for, and that is also, it's not just to do with kind of personal lack of knowledge, it's to do with institutional structures and how they're built based on these kind of dominant departments and the resources that are allocated to them. I think I will end there for now.
All right, thank you. We'll start taking questions from the audience now. And talking about politics and bureaucracy, there is a question from Lashaya Howie, who asks, this has been touched on, but I'd like it to be made explicit. Can you historicize and map out the politics of naming a department, Native Studies, Critical Indigenous Studies, etc.?
Well, terminology changes over time, right? So we began as American Indian Studies, not in Canada though, they don't use that. Yeah, well, maybe they had Indian Studies. Native Studies then comes about in the 80s, probably. We moved to Indigenous Studies in the 90s and 2000s. We are just now in Canada, moving from Native Studies to Indigenous Studies. Sometimes it's First Nation Studies. So really it's always politically contextual. It's always place-based and time-based as to the terms that you're using. So yeah, I know it, And some terms sound antiquated or inappropriate in some places, right? Like native does not fly, I don't think, in New Zealand and Australia at all. It sounds retrograde to them. And it's beginning to sound retrograde to some people up here. It's quite common to call something Native American studies still in the US. You wouldn't hear that in Canada, obviously. So I do think we are seeing a movement towards, the reason NASA is called Native American and Indigenous Studies is because it was disproportionately founded by Americans, and they argued for that. There were a lot of the people in other countries didn't want the Native American on that. They just wanted the Indigenous Studies Association. So that was kind of a concession to Americans, I think. So the critical Indigenous studies, I don't know that there's any departments that have that on their name yet. So really it is a negotiation, I think, locally, regionally, and in terms of what moment we're living in. So if that answers the question.
Yeah, and as a side note, I'll say that what my major as an undergrad was Aboriginal Studies in Toronto.
Yeah.
So terminology changes.
Right, and Canada's moved from Aboriginal to Indigenous pretty widely about 10 years ago, right? Yeah, we never say Aboriginal in the US, so yeah. Yeah, that's right, I forgot about that. I think you told me that before.
Yeah. Clint?
I think Kim answered it really well in terms of terminology. I will say that, thinking about our PhD program and having recent dialogues that are still in formation, so I'm not going to speak definitively, but that has come up, is what does it mean to see or to receive a PhD in ethnic studies? Right now, again, we talk about concessions that are made. I don't want to go too far in the weeds here, but it's currently phrased as a comparative ethnic studies PhD. We've recently been kind of questioning why that is. And I think, there's a certain amount of concession that was made during the process of getting this approved by a conservative board of regents back in the day, before I even arrived at CU Boulder. And we're starting to question and wonder, what it would look like and how much it would kind of open things up in terms of what our students are feel free to do with their work, to call it a critical ethnic studies PhD program, which again, signaling the recent work that's really come out in terms of criticality. I could point to an edited volume that I'm not exactly, I'm blanking on the editors here, but we look at the Critical Ethnic Studies Association as another example. And, I would encourage you to go to their website and look at their mission statement and how they define critical ethnic studies in relation to Indigenous studies. And I think that when we look at that burgeoning association, the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, it really helps me think about, again, my position within an ethnic studies department and working, I'm the associate chair of graduate studies for our PhD program. Still feel like I'm learning the ropes in that regard, but nonetheless, getting me to think in these ways of, in terms of supporting our students and, the work that they do across the field, what this looks like and how to best position them for success in their various disciplines, but also just in the field generally and in academia.
All right, thank you. Second question comes to us from Tara Bui. I apologize if I'm butchering your name. So the question is, what are some ways an austere institution like UChicago can nurture Indigenous scholars and recruit them into a critical race program before they even enter the university? I'm thinking of budding intellectuals from nearby communities. UChicago does not make much of an effort to bring in and nurture Black scholars from the South Side and from Black communities in neighboring states like Gary, Indiana. How do we avoid ending up with an Indigenous studies program full of non-Indigenous scholars? And how do we shift our priorities so that we can appropriately support and see Black and Indigenous people of color scholars through the program successfully and helpfully, especially local, non-international Black and Indigenous people of color from lower socioeconomic standing?
It's always like a chicken and egg thing, right? Well, first of all, money, like you need money. You have to pay for, I don't know what you all do around there, right? Again, I teach at public institutions where the tuition has been relatively low, especially in Canada. I don't know, what's your tuition there for undergrads? Is it like MIT and Harvard, like $60,000 a year or something?
I actually am not sure, but I would guess that it's not very far.
Yeah, then
I
money.
could be wrong.
Also, you know, the transition year stuff, right? When you're talking about, and this is for all poor students, not just, you know, Native students or Black students or other students of color, people are coming through school systems without adequate math and science training, without adequate, you know, what they need to get into these elite institutions. So I feel like it's hard for me to answer these questions because I'm not at an elite private, I'm at a public institution, and we have, it's hard enough here, but we have transition year programs that are, you know, focusing on readying students coming out who have inadequate high school preparation. Our tuitions are relatively low. In terms of it's an interesting question. How do you get an Indigenous studies that's not staffed by a bunch of non-Indigenous people? That's a long conversation, right? That's a long conversation. Or, yeah, well, there's more I could say about that. That's where the chicken and egg thing comes in. You need actual connected Indigenous people in positions of authority and leadership who have the networks to be able to help you make the right hires, do the right recruiting. Really, it is all about networks, and people who are disconnected, whether they're Indigenous or not, if they're disconnected from Indigenous community, can't help you do that work. I mean, we at the University of Alberta, we are Indigenous dominated, but we are self-confident enough and Indigenous controlled enough to hire non-Indigenous scholars. And we do have non-Indigenous students in our grad program too. And we feel pretty comfortable with our ability to be very inclusive because we're not worried about being dominated or overrun by non-Indigenous people setting the agenda. And it's really an amazing position to be in. But, you know, you get that. Yeah, I'm not really answering the question. There was so much in that question too. These are really interesting things to think about how you work this out. And a lot of that, really the questions I think have to be answered by people who know that institution and know that region, as well as have deep connections with Indigenous community, however that's relevant in your area.
Yeah, Clint?
Yeah, I would agree. It's hard to, Kim, you keep reminding me of like the differences here, and I'll just kind of footnote that because it's really important to note. It's a different scenario, and but at the same time, I will talk about some of the ways that, in which we're approaching these types of issues, because CU Boulder is not U Alberta. It's absolutely a PWI, you know, a predominantly white institution, and it's also very, very low in terms of Indigenous student representation. And so thinking about that as you know, how are we working toward a better future for our students and more robust student representation at CU, I will just say we've been really moving forward on this in bold ways during you know, recent times, and I think that you know, we have to credit a lot of the activism that's been happening across the United States, specifically Black Lives Matter, in terms of just sending a shockwave through our upper administration, and also emboldening and activating our students in ways that is just really inspiring to see. And so, again, I'm trying to compartmentalize for time here in terms of my hat that I wear as an ethnic studies faculty member, and as and then the other hat that I wear as a board member for the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies. And one thing that we've been working on in response to and this might be a little in terms of strategy, it was an unfortunate remark that our president uttered. But nonetheless, I took it and ran with it as an opportunity to launch a critique against the administrator or the administration about systemic and structural forms of racism and colonial oppression. Our CU president uttered the phrase "Trail of Tears" when making a reference to the challenges of online education. And, that prompted me to write an op-ed as a Cherokee person of, you know, why this utterance was so easily made, and also why it wasn't caught in advance by anyone else until after we called it out. And so that was, it started as a statement from CNAs, from our center, and then I turned it into an op-ed. And it prompted a dialogue with the president and the chief diversity officer. It also prompted a dialogue with our campus, our chancellor and our provost toward better support systems for our current students that interestingly were there in the past, but had been chipped away on through the last decade or two. Again, looking at this, CU Boulder was Vine Deloria's old and former institution before he passed on, and during his time and shortly after had a robust Native community with student support systems that have since been eroded. So how do we regain that? And also, we were pushing on the movement that, again, has been influenced by and large, from First Nations in what is known as Canada and again, this is a deeply, complex issue, but land acknowledgement. What would that look like for the University of Colorado system? And also to make sure that these aren't empty words. What that has led to, I won't list through the entire details of what we demanded, but see, the University of Colorado does have an official land acknowledgement now, and through, again, the networking and the relationships that we were able to build with other ally administrators and our certain members of our Board of Regents at the system level, we were able to advocate for, and it is not official yet, but it's looking good, in-state tuition for all enrolled students who are enrolled in federally recognized nations, Indigenous nations that once called the land that Colorado has claimed as Colorado home. And so really 48 different federally recognized tribes, those who are, students would have access to CU Boulder and the other campuses, really, I think, to universities throughout the state as in-state tuition, recognizing, again, that these are colonial borders and not ones of any others making. So again, this brings up the chicken and egg thing. Okay, if we get it done, that's wonderful. It's still expensive. Where are the resources that are going to attract students? Where are the resources that are going to retain and provide a community for students? These are all questions that we have at the front of our minds in terms of continuing the momentum that we've been able to garner through literally holding, well, not literally, but holding our administrators' feet to the fire due to the moment that we inhabit right now, this critical moment that offers so much transformational possibilities.
I know we are out of time and so many questions in the chat. So I'll read one last question and I'm sorry, everyone, we won't be able to attend to your questions, but Lee Beldo asks, what are the most urgent and specific theoretical questions in Indigenous studies in your view? So urgent, specifically theoretical questions in Indigenous studies. We can close on that one.
You go first, Clint. What do you think?
I was banking on the order that I've been used to. Well, I'll just say what I've been working on lately, and this may prompt Kim you to respond, because again, I've been reading your work on intellectual promiscuity, as you term it, or disciplinary promiscuity, and thinking about what, and we had this conversation in a room in Waikato at NASA a couple years ago regarding what does it look like for Indigenous studies to be centered in a lot of these new turns that are kind of replicating the same old story when it comes to Indigenous studies or Indigenous peoples as subjects, rather than engaging with our theories and ways of being critically and sincerely. And so for me, I'm working with a small collective, if you will. It's really just an informal group, we've gotten together to talk about Indigenous political ecologies, and you know, we're experimenting with different ways of pushing back against the word ecology too, and so maybe Indigenous political relationalities as being more reflective of where we're headed intellectually, and how can we both intervene in ways that are productive, but also that launch a critique toward those fields that tend to take indigeneity and run with it as an object of study rather than as something to engage with as far as the intellectual production of Native scholarships and or Native scholarship through Indigenous studies. And through that, it's information. I think that's kind of less of a theory, or it's more of kind of an approach to how we might continue theorizing and engaging with this space that we call the academy in productive ways that, again, to kind of draw from your work, Kim, creates new relationships in ways that, that open up possibilities for intellectual production, knowledge production, but also for work that directly benefits our communities.
Yeah, I think at U of A, I mean, we have people doing legal projects, film, business. I do sexuality and environmental stuff. We've got science studies. We've got creative people doing creative work, performance. Everything's going back to relational frameworks for us. And particularly because we're in where we are, people are using a Wokotowin framework, which is coming out of Cree and Métis worldviews. I'm still getting familiar with that. So not that we don't, you know, we're not all Cree and Métis, but we do try to focus on and center the analytical frameworks coming out of these languages here. But it is very much in keeping with the relational frameworks that are being foregrounded in Indigenous studies, I would say, around the world, as far as I can tell. So.
All right. Well, we won't keep you much longer. Thank you very much, Kim and Clint, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, our audience, that because of the new configuration, we can't really see or engage with except through chat rooms. Thank you, everyone. And please sign up for the next event, which will happen March 5th with Beverly Guy Schefter, Joshua Myers, and it will be a conversation on historically Black colleges and university. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.